I awoke suddenly as if someone had tugged at my shoulder. The night air in the room felt damp and heavy, as if saturated with old secrets of this house. A faint unease stirred in my heart, yet shapeless, not fully formed into thoughts or fears. I could only lie there in the darkness, listening to the faint creaks of the old walls, lulling me until something changed. There was a sound beyond the door. At first I thought it was just the old floorboards creaking under their own weight. Someone was cautiously trying to open the front door. My hand clutched the edge of the blanket, and I froze, listening intently. The rustling repeated, but unmistakable. It was as if I'd been cast into stillness. Even my breathing felt loud, like a thieving confession of my fear. In the dark hallway, dimly lit by the glow of a nightlight, someone stood. A silhouette almost merging with the night shadows. I recognized him, Michael. His face was half shrouded in darkness, but his eyes— there was something unfamiliar and frightening in his gaze. He seemed torn between the urge to leave and to stay, his hand hesitantly resting on the doorknob. I tried to call out to him, but only a barely audible whisper escaped my lips. Michael did not respond, didn't move, only looked at me with a strange, tense expression, as though trying to convey something without words. Something important, significant. The minutes stretched on as if time itself had stopped. My heart beat faster and faster while he continued to stand there, his gaze unyielding. When I finally mustered the courage to reach out, to somehow summon him, and took an uncertain step, he quietly, almost imperceptibly like a shadow, stepped back, disappearing behind the door. The sound of his footsteps dissolved into the night's silence, leaving me alone. Alone among these long-forgotten walls, which seemed to have grown foreign over all the years of absence. The morning was gray, as if the sky had chosen to remain silent about what had happened during the night. I woke up late, not to sunlight but to a light rain drumming on the roof. Everything from last night now seemed like a half-dream. Michael, his gaze, the way he disappeared. Doubts gradually filled my mind. Could it have been just a trick of my imagination? This house, where I hadn't been in so long, and the childhood memories buried deep, but not forgotten, could easily have played a cruel joke on me. I tried to distract myself by taking a walk along the river. There was something calming about the water, and its gentle splashes grounded me back in. The landscape around me seemed unchanged since the days when Michael and I, as children, would explore this place. And then I remembered our hidden spot under the old bridge. Something distant, a forgotten part of my past, seemed to draw me there. There, beneath a layer of damp soil, I found an old tin box where we'd stashed our treasures. It was almost funny, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it right away, as if afraid to shatter something priceless. When I finally opened it, a wave of memories flooded over me. A battered doll missing an arm, my old diary with its bright pages, Michael's faded notebook filled with scribbles. Something felt so familiar and dear, yet distant, as though these were relics of another, belonging to different people. The children we once were. I leaped through my diary, and each word burned, reminding me of childhood fears and secrets that had seemingly turned to dust long ago. Something is watching us. I read my own shaky handwriting, scrawled after another late-night walk. I remembered how Michael and I would laugh, trying to scare each other by imagining horrors in the darkness. But now it didn't seem amusing. The events of last night surged back to me with full force. At that moment, I realized I couldn't just dismiss the night's vision as a trick of the mind. Something was wrong. I had to see Michael and ask him what had really happened last night. The next day, I headed to the farmer's market, knowing there was a good chance Michael would be there. Every Saturday, bright stalls filled the square near the town hall. The aromas of fresh vegetables, spicy herbs, and baked goods mingled with the loud hum of buyers and vendors, creating a cozy yet bustling atmosphere. I searched for Michael and finally spotted him, standing by a stall with rare plants, absorbed in studying the unusual leaves as if he'd closed himself off from everything around him. I approached, trying to hide my nervousness. He noticed me and smiled warmly, as though the incident last night had never happened. It was disconcerting. I hesitated to bring up what had troubled me all night, but after gathering my thoughts, I cautiously asked Michael, "Were you by any chance at the house last night?" His gaze remained calm, but I detected a hint of tension in his expression, barely noticeable, like a light breeze brushing against one's face. Without hesitation, he replied, "No, of course not. Why would I go there at night?" His words sounded convincing, yet something didn't sit right with me. It felt as if there was more hidden beneath his calmness, something he didn't want to reveal. Just immediately, he steered the conversation away, pointing out an unusual flower that reminded both of us of our childhood adventures. He spoke about the strange plant, claiming it supposedly had unique properties, and I caught a hint of enthusiasm in his voice, but the enthusiasm seemed feigned. It was as though he was using his words to mask the real answer, steering me away from the truth I could already sense. We stood there among the colorful stalls, the hum of people, and the bright sunlight, and suddenly I felt that something invisible but palpable had come between us. I wanted to look closer, to see past his smile, to understand what exactly had changed, but Michael seemed intent on diverting me from our midnight conversation, once again engrossed in antique books at a nearby stall. His interest seemed genuine, yet I saw something else in his eyes. It was as if he were letting me know he wasn't ready for the truth. Or perhaps he was simply afraid of it. Later that day, Michael suggested we go to the festival by the lake, a small gathering that attracted locals and farmers from nearby towns. I agreed, hoping that this outing might shed some light on things or perhaps bring back the easy connection we once shared. On the way to the lake, Michael chatted as usual, laughing, sharing recent stories, and I almost allowed myself to believe that everything between us remained unchanged. The festival was brimming with life, colorful tents, the smell of roasted corn, children's laughter, and the soft glow of string lights hanging from tree branches. The air carried a mix of scents, spices, freshly baked bread, something smoky and unusual. Vendors displayed handicrafts, rare plants, old books, and various exotic items. Michael led me to the stalls, where a contest for the best ghostly photo was being held. Participants lined up to take pictures, and closed booths set up to resemble old attics or abandoned libraries. It was all in good fun, and I felt some of the tension within me ease. But as soon as we started taking pictures, I noticed Michael withdrawing again. He stood a bit to the side, staring off into the distance with a focused and almost sorrowful expression. It seemed odd, especially since he had always been the life of the party, the one who could cheer everyone up. I caught his gaze, and in that moment, something in his eyes made me feel uneasy. It was the look of someone thinking about something deeply personal and important, but afraid to share it. I wanted to ask what was troubling him, but just then the crowd around us erupted in laughter at the latest ghost caught in a photo, and we got swept up in the fun like everyone else. Yet even the laughter and the lights couldn't drown out the strange feeling that had settled in me. I had the sense that Michael wanted to say something he was carefully hiding, and the feeling only grew stronger. As we left the festival, Michael was lost in his thoughts, as if none of it had affected him. I sensed he was on the verge of saying something, the words seemingly on his lips, but he only gave me a brief, meaningful look. It felt as if this evening marked the beginning of something complicated and inevitable between us, like the first wave before a storm. The next day, I decided to visit Michael at the flea market, where he sometimes sold antiques he'd gathered from his attic. The market was set up on a vacant lot outside town, and the wind tossed dry leaves in the air, as if breathing life into the atmosphere of long-forgotten days. It seemed like every object here held its own story, a silent witness to someone's old emotions and memories. I found Michael arranging a small collection of antique clocks on a table, each unique in shape and style, their surfaces faintly gleaming in the autumn sun. As I approached, I casually asked him where he'd gotten all these items and why clocks fascinated him so much. His answer caught me off guard. He looked thoughtfully at one of the large bronze models and almost in a whisper said, "You know, clocks can hold memories of those who own them. It's as if something of them remains within, like a fragment of time, frozen in the mechanism." His words were strange, yet they stirred dormant memories within me. Childhood, our fascination with the mystical, when we were sure that everything around us had a secret life of its own. I watched his hands as he carefully adjusted the clocks, and there was a depth in his gaze I hadn't expected to see from him in a long time. "Do you remember our old hiding spot?" I asked, trying to draw him into conversation. "I found it recently under the bridge. Everything is still there, as if no time has passed." Michael tensed for a moment, his gaze becoming distant. He didn't respond right away, but eventually gave a slight nod, avoiding my eyes. We had a lot of secrets, didn't we? And maybe some of them never really left. A shiver ran through me at his words, innocent though they appeared. This time, he didn't try to avoid the topic, Yet I sensed something more hidden between the lines of his answer. It felt like he was concealing something, and with every glance I became more convinced that his secret wasn't just echoes of the past, but something alive within him now. He quickly changed the subject, beginning to tell me about a rare clock on his table, but I found it hard to focus on his words. I realized that he definitely knew more than he was letting on, and that my questions about the events of that night, his strange gaze, and our encounter at the doorstep had not gone unnoticed. I felt that the truth was close, but it would take patience to wait for the moment he was ready to confess. Late in the evening, Michael unexpectedly suggested we go to the old lookout point, outside town, the very place where we used to spend hours stargazing and watching meteor falls. The proposal struck me as strange, almost daring, but I agreed. On the way, he spoke about a new project that had captured his interest for some time, but there was an edge of nervousness in his voice. We both knew we were stalling, skirting around the questions hanging between us since that night, yet neither of us dared to break the fragile balance. When we arrived and sat on the concrete parapet, a thick silence settled around us, broken only by the whisper of the wind and occasional sounds from the forest. The lights of the town glimmered in the distance, seeming like a mirage, unreachable and far away. I turned to Michael, intending to say something, but he spoke first, and I sensed a tension in his voice I hadn't noticed before. "Do you think places can hold memories?" he asked suddenly, not looking at me. His gaze was fixed far off, as if trying to see something beyond the horizon. The question caught me off guard. It sounded almost too personal, as if he were leading me towards something he couldn't or wouldn't say aloud. I stared at him silently, unsure of how to respond. His words seemed to linger in the air, as if the question was not only for me, but also for the place that surrounded us. "Yes," I answered carefully, choosing my words. "Some places probably act like sponges, absorbing everything that happens to them. Maybe we leave a part of ourselves behind here when we go." Michael nodded, and in his eyes I glimpsed deep hidden pain, as if he saw an entire gallery of ghosts from the past who knew him, who knew us both. I didn't know how to continue, how to reach out so he would feel safe enough to share what he had kept inside for so long. Our eyes met, and in his gaze I saw an inexpressible sadness and at the same time a silent plea. Suddenly, I felt that if he didn't say it aloud now, there would remain something unbearable, insurmountable between us. But he looked away, as if something within him broke, and his voice regained its familiar, restrained tone. We sat there in silence, staring at the darkening sky. I realized that Michael had taken the first step toward opening up his secret. But for now, he had left me standing at its threshold, allowing me only to brush my fingers against its cold surface. In an attempt to ease the tension and distract ourselves, I remembered one of our old pastimes. As teenagers, Michael and I had found a drone with a camera in the attic and turned it into our tool for surveillance. Back then, we joked that it was our spy camera and loved to observe the lives of neighbors or random passersby strolling through the woods near the lookout point. Recalling this, I noticed a spark in Michael's eyes, a flicker of that lightheartedness I hadn't seen in a long time. He pulled a small drone from his backpack, covered in dust with a few scratched blades, the very same one our old adventure companion. I couldn't help but smile as he powered it up, and we started watching couples walking along the cliff nearby. It was amusing to observe their awkward poses, their attempts at privacy, and for a moment, I even forgot what had been weighing on me these past few days. But still, there was something in each glance Michael exchanged with me that reminded me something between us had shifted. At one point I turned toward him and his gaze met mine. This time his eyes held not only sadness but a kind of determination, something he was barely holding back, almost ready to share. He looked at me as if he was waiting for something. Waiting for me to do what? Perhaps he hoped I'd ask him outright, that I'd demand answers, but I froze, unable to break the delicate balance, afraid that any words would shatter the strange connection that had appeared between us in that moment. We continued piloting the drone, but even the game couldn't dispel the sense that something indescribable hung over us like a shadow. The sky slowly darkened as the drone glided back toward us. Watching it land, I felt a mix of anxiety and unspoken longing that I couldn't fully learn. Michael put the drone away, and once again silence pressed down on us, heavy and laden with something unsaid. I could feel that every look he gave me was filled with something deep and painful, something he perhaps didn't entirely understand himself. The storm caught us off guard that evening. Rain began suddenly, large drops drumming on the roof of the old shelter by the cliff where we'd taken cover, with flashes of lightning tearing through the darkness. We sat close together, listening to the sound of the rain, while a nearly tangible tension thickened in the air. It felt as if the storm outside mirrored the turmoil building within Michael. He sat still, yet something in his expression had changed. Finally breaking the oppressive silence, Michael spoke. At first his voice was hesitant, but it gradually grew stronger, tinged with a sense of desperation, as though he had needed to say this for a long time. "You were right," he breathed, not looking at me. "I was at the house that night. But it wasn't just, I don't know how to explain it," he muttered, clutching his head. "I felt for so long that I can't escape these feelings." His words were difficult to grasp, but I sensed an underlying torment. I sat silently, stunned, unable to interrupt as the rain poured endlessly, muffling the far sounds of his confession. He continued, as if struggling through a thickness of words. "It's strange, almost unnatural, but I feel something I can't control. These places, these memories, it's all bound to me somehow." His voice was filled with pain, as if he were confessing something that had been tearing at him from within. His words stuck in my mind, unable to form a coherent picture, and I looked at him as though seeing him for the first time. Michael exhaled, dropping his gaze as if expecting judgment. In that moment I realized how deeply he feared losing me. Or perhaps not me exactly, but the connection we had since childhood, the secret that had made us inseparable. I placed my hand on his shoulder, trying to show that I was here, that he could keep going. But instead of words, he leaned in and kissed me. After that night, I couldn't find peace within myself. Michael's words, his confession, and the strange feelings it stirred left me restless. In the days that followed, I wandered through the city, searching for answers no one could provide. I stopped by old bookstores, roamed antique shops, staring at shelves lined with dusty, run objects, each of them holding its own story. It felt as if these items were whispering the answers I so desperately needed. One day, while passing by a display of vintage cameras and clock mechanisms, I froze, feeling inexplicably drawn to it. Among the dozens of models stood a camera that looked just like the one Michael and I had. It appeared just as old and scratched, the film inside likely dried up long ago. And in that moment I realized that between Michael and me, like between me and this camera, there stood an invisible barrier. It was as though there was something between us that belonged to the past, something that couldn't be brought back, like a frozen image that couldn't be revived. This realization burned through me, stirring an almost unbearable longing for those days when everything was simple. Michael and I could wander these streets, invent our own games, believe in hidden connections and secrets. But now I understood that something had changed, that we had crossed a line where only adult feelings existed, tangled with fear, desire, and yearning. And this feeling clung to me, refusing to let go. I returned home feeling as though I had walked through an invisible maze only to end up at. Michael and I had been avoiding each other, our conversations growing strained, the air between us heavy with remnants of his confession. I realized I could no longer ignore his feelings or my own. Michael, as if sensing that we both needed an escape, suggested we go to an escape room, hoping to bring back some lightness and distract us from the tension that had been hanging over us for the past week. We chose a theme of an old mansion with secret doors and dark mysteries, thinking that maybe the game would help us feel like our old selves again. Entering the cramped, dimly lit space, I immediately felt a chill, not just physical, but psychological, as though the place was mirroring what had been happening between us. We wandered through the rooms, searching for keys and solving puzzles, trying to shake off the awkwardness. And then, at one point, the lights in one of the rooms suddenly went out, leaving us in complete darkness. I became acutely aware of how close I was standing to him, how I could feel his breath, and then we kissed again. We had only a few fleeting moments before the lights flickered back on. When the light returned, I saw his eyes. He was looking at me intently, as if he'd forgotten we were just playing a game. His gaze was so deep, so filled with pain that it took my breath away. We continued with the game, but everything felt dreamlike. My thoughts were a mess, and I caught every one of his movements, every glance, until I realized I could no longer ignore it. Once outside, it hit me. We couldn't keep avoiding the truth. Whatever was between us wasn't just memories, wasn't just nostalgia. It had become something far more complex, like a mosaic that couldn't be pieced together without acknowledging each part of it fully. Several months passed. I tried to leave behind that whirlwind of emotions and find peace. I even began dating someone new, a kind, dependable person, someone who might have been my fresh start. One day, while sitting on the roof of my house, basking in the warm rays of the sun and breathing in the crisp autumn air, I thought that maybe finally I had found my harmony. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen and froze. It was Michael. My fingers trembled, and for a moment I considered not answering, leaving everything as it was. But something inside nudged me forward. Maybe that same inexplicable pull that had always bound us together. "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, but the note of nervousness in his reply told me he knew. I hadn't been able to forget him. We agreed to meet on the roof of my house, like we used to as kids, sneaking up there, to watch the stars and share our dreams. He arrived with that same slightly awkward but determined look, and when we were alone, among the city lights, I saw in his eyes the same deep, unspoken longing I had seen that night during the storm. I tried to put it all behind me. He said softly, stepping closer, "But I just can't. I can't stop thinking about you. It's more than memories. It's this pull that keeps drawing me back to you. Never and over again, and I'm tired of pretending I can just walk away from it." His words awakened everything I had tried so desperately to hide, and I could no longer deny the truth. This feeling, it lived inside me like a quiet flame, warming and burning at the same time. I looked at him for a long time, into his honest, earnest eyes, and realized I couldn't keep running either. We sat in silence on the roof, but it was a silence that felt full, complete, like a mutual confession. In those months we had traveled a long path from fear to truth, and this was our new conscious choice. That night on the roof marked the start of a new chapter. We no longer tried to hide behind old memories or fears. We were adults, fully aware that we had found each other not by chance. Years passed since that confession on the rooftop. Life with its routines and events seemed to dull the sharp edges of those intense feelings Michael and I once shared. We remained together, but in a new way, not bound anymore by the past or unspoken fears, but rather accepting each other more calmly and maturely. We were building our own story, but every time I looked back on that night on the rooftop, I felt that something within us had quietly yet profoundly shifted. We moved into a new home, finally leaving behind the old family estate, and that place no longer held us. Our days filled with ordinary things, work, friends, travel, but there was always something between us, subtle and invisible to others. It wasn't passion, rather it was a quiet, understanding bond, like a warm pull that needed no words. I knew that each of us held on to the memory of how we had faced those secrets and fears together, the ghosts of our past and our doubts, and how in the end we found each other in reality. Sometimes when we sat together in silence, I'd catch his gaze and it would take me back to that night, to the way he stood before me, open and vulnerable, entrusting me with his pain and worries, and I knew then that it had been real. What began as a childhood fascination as shared secrets and make-believe adventures had grown into something much deeper. We never spoke of it out loud. Time did its work, and we didn't need new declarations. Our love became something that reminded us of itself without words. It was as though life itself had taken on the role of narrator, weaving our stories into the steady, unhurried rhythm of each day. In those moments when our hands brushed, when the nights were quiet and the house filled with light, I felt gratitude for everything we had been through. And though others might not have noticed, our present, our time, was now woven with memories and an unspoken certainty that it had all been worth it. The years continued to pass and life settled into its quiet rhythm. Michael and I had firmly rooted ourselves in our new home, and time, like a master craftsman, gradually softened the sharp edges of our past. Yet there remained something elusive between us, a thread that stretched through all the changes, through years and routines. This sense of connection lived in the simplest things, in the habit of touching each other and passing, in the gentle smile we'd share when one of us remembered something meaningful. Sometimes random objects, lost and then found in the house, would evoke images from the fleet past, a book, an old notebook forgotten on a shelf. They each stirred shadows of that time when we were just beginning to learn how to understand each other. Michael never again spoke of that night by the river, of his midnight visit to the abandoned house, or of his confession on the rooftop. We both knew it had become part of our past, but that memory, like a precious gem, was hidden deep within us both, and each glimmer of it had become inseparable from what we VO had created together. There were times when life demanded simplicity, when responsibilities and concerns pushed everything else aside. But sometimes I'd catch myself looking at Michael, at his profile in the evening light, and I'd be overtaken by that same feeling. Something close to that first childish thrill, which had started as a game and ended as in one unpredictable, real emotion. He felt it too. He'd turn to look at me, and in his eyes there was always that quiet, unchanging warmth that only we understood. On one of our recent trips, walking along the familiar river, we found the old bridge again, the place where our secret hideout had once been. Stopping, I suddenly felt that this place, this moment, was still alive, that it held our childhood souls, our fears and hopes, like a frozen scene from the past. We stood there in silence, and I felt Michael's hand in mine. "You know," he said softly, as if he'd returned to that distant night, "some moments aren't just memories. They're like those old clocks I once sold. They absorb time and never leave." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The past and present were woven between us, and in every step we took, in every glance we exchanged, in every quiet moment, there was a part of those years when it all began. It was more than just a story. It had become our shared memory, alive in every day we spent together. The years gradually brought Michael and me into a new circle, the circle of family. When our son was born, we both felt as if everything in our past, all the secret hideouts, midnight walks, and heartfelt confessions had only been preparing us for what was beginning now. Our lives filled with new responsibilities, but each time we looked at our child, I saw something familiar in his eyes. As though he carried within him all that bound Michael and me together, all that had withstood the test of time. We settled in a house near the river, the very shore where our story had first begun. Sometimes I felt as if this place held memories of all we'd been through, as if it too had become part of our family. In the evenings as we put our son to bed, it sometimes seemed to us that he dreamed of the same mysteries and wonders we had once searched for his children. One day, when he was a bit older, we took him to the old bridge under which Michael and I had once hidden our little treasure. He dug excitedly in the dirt, examining each stone with wonder, and I found myself realizing that as parents we were beginning a new cycle of memories. Our son was a bridge between our past and our future, connecting all our childhood dreams to what lay ahead. He breathed new life into what had seemed finished, and now each day felt like a new chapter, one we were writing together with him.